Hey audiophiles, Fernando from Sky-Fi Audio. Well, lately I've been on a Sony kick. I've done reviews on a bunch of different pieces from the 80s and 90s. All have been well received and it's been a ton of fun. So this week I went through the shop looking for a topic for today's video, and of course these Sonys caught my eye. We've had them for probably about a year or so, and they are incredibly special, not just in design and build quality, but also in quantities. They only made about 100 of these pieces, so they're super, super rare. Today I am going to dive deep. We're going to talk about the specifications, the build quality. We're going to look at the features in the front, connections on the back, and then we're going to crack them open and see what's inside, see what all the hoopla is about, and see if they're worth their asking price. So hang in there, like and subscribe if we've earned your attention, and we'll get right into it. So first I'm going to give you some close-ups so you can see the sheer massiveness of this amplifier. It has got to be measuring close to 2 feet deep and about 11-12 inches tall. It's finished in this classic sort of dark blue on the heat sinks, and of course aluminum, tons of aluminum, hundreds of pounds of aluminum as a matter of fact. This model is the TA-N1, and the matching preamp, which is sitting right here, is the TA-E1, common naming convention for Sony. This is referred to as essentially the 1 series. And the matching piece is not here. That would be the SCD-1, which was a Super Audio CD player of the same era, of the same series, and just a very similar case design and form and function. So these 3 pieces were meant to go together. We've since sold this Super Audio CD player. Now they're a mixed bag, the Super Audio CD player. They are super cool. They're the best CD player, or second from the best that Sony ever made. But they tend to be unreliable. The lasers go over time, and it is a bear to fix. I've never successfully fixed one. I'm sure there are technicians that know how to do them, but I've had no luck with them. And the way they go is eventually the laser for the Super Audio side will start failing, and then eventually the main laser as well. So back to these beauties. This is the top of the top from Sony. There were a couple of pieces later that try to challenge this, but I believe it was an integrated in the DR1 series. So the TA-DR1 was the integrated, and a matching Super Audio CD player, the SCD-1, could be considered above this because there were later, but it was an integrated. It wasn't separates like this. So this is what I consider to be their top dog. So back to the cabinet design. It's got a pretty funky angle on the front, and it matches the preamp as well. Beautiful Sony machined aluminum top on the amplifier, and same on the preamp. They've actually separated into 2 modules, and this is reminiscent of a much older preamp from Sony, which I love as well. And I'll put a link to that one in the description. So same blue finish on the sides, looks like some sort of powder coat or high gloss finish. Fairly simple in design, just 2 knobs and 4 buttons. And same for the amplifier. All we've got is essentially a power button and not much else to it. So for basic characteristics, the amplifier, the N1, is a 200 watt per channel amplifier into 8 ohms, and it will double to 400 watts at 4 ohms. The preamp itself is fairly simple in design and execution and features. It is a line level only. There is no phono section, as with most preamps from this particular era. Once the CD and the SACD took over the world, manufacturers stopped putting phono sections into their preamps, which is a real bummer. So pretty simple, balanced inputs and outputs, and a great chassis design and construction. Really not much else to it. Later on we'll take a look inside, but let me tell you some of the features that are listed in the brochure for this. So there are 10 pairs of non-magnetic gold-plated MOSFETs. This is a MOSFET Legato series amplifier design using 10 pairs, and that's a 2SJ120A and 2SK1530A. That's the MOSFETs that are in this unit. They use metal core modules to house some of the components. The aluminum amount of aluminum used is absolutely absurd. They've got a 10 to 15 millimeter aluminum chassis of varying thicknesses, top, bottom, everywhere, and weighs in at 150 pounds, which is absolute insanity. Probably one of the heaviest amplifiers for the wattage that I've seen to date. The massive heat sinks on the left and right channels are said to weigh around 16 kilograms, which is 30-something pounds. The toroidal transformers are 1.5 kVA, and it's potted in some sort of ceramic enclosure. We'll find that later when we crack it open. The rectifier section uses 30 amp diodes, which is crazy. And it is a Class AB design, so even though it's an exotic case, the design of the circuitry is fairly simple at Class AB, which is great because it doesn't get too hot like some of the Class A amplifiers would. And then they also claim to have linear phase throughout, so that it can match up with the SACD player properly. And we found that to be the case in both the amp and the preamp. And it's essentially, they're claiming that the phase is linear up to 100 kilohertz. Not sure why that's important, but we'll figure it out later. Same thing for the preamp. Excuse me. They're claiming to be a high bandwidth design. The aluminum chassis is a centimeter thick, and there are portions of it where I've spotted some copper, and I think there are a couple of copper plates sandwiched in there somewhere. The top measures 7 millimeters in thickness. The power supply and rectification are separate, which you don't really usually see. Most manufacturers bundle the transformers and all the power supplies and rectification into the same area, but they've separated in here. The potentiometer for the volume control, which is the most critical device, is a 5 centimeter in diameter plastic potentiometer with all sorts of crazy copper in it. And they're claiming an error of half a dB from 0 to 100 dBs or minus 100, which is pretty impressive. They also claim that the power supply uses nickel cobalt iron in a ceramic box so that no flux magically leaks out of the unit. There are 4 metal core modules inside, separating the input and the output stages, which provide heat sinking and also decoupling. All components are surface mounted, which is to reduce essentially the signal length, or the signal pack length, and give you a better idea of the controls. We'll go through the controls later on the bench. It's a little easier. And now let's take a look at the back. So the back's pretty simple. You do see the aluminum chassis with the copper plate just behind it. It's set in a little further. From left to right, we've got line outputs. We've got line 1 and line 2 next to a CD input and SACD input. So this tells you a lot about the era where this came from, the fact that they've actually labeled one of the inputs SACD. Actually, these lines are just unlabeled regular inputs. They're not outputs. And then they've got a balanced input here of your choice. Moving on, I've got a direct input and then 2 sets of tape loops labeled tape 2 and tape 1. And interestingly enough, they've also labeled those with hardware appropriate for the age. Tape 2 is labeled MiniDisc and tape 1 is labeled digital audio tape. Then we've got a single set of pre-outputs, single-ended, and then the balanced outputs. And then to the right, we've got a standard IEC removable power cord. And this is a US market unit rated at 120 volts. Interesting, they've got a serial number tag here. Excuse me, but I don't see the serial number. It must be somewhere else on this unit. Looking at the back of the amplifier, we've got 2 sets of binding posts. I've never seen this type before. They do seem to accept bananas and fairly large spades. I don't see facilities for bare wire, which we don't really use anymore. But yeah, 2 sets A and B, left and right. And then down below, we've got 2 sets of unbalanced inputs. and the set of balanced inputs, and then selectable by this input switch. Be nice if this switch had made it to the front of the unit. It would make this a little more usable, but here it is. Not quite sure what you'd want, 2 sets of unbalanced inputs, but if you have ideas on that, please leave it in the comments below. And a super high quality aluminum knob throughout. And then the pinout. This lets us know what their intended pinout is for the XLR jacks, which is important because the earlier Sony piece that I reviewed not long ago actually had an unconventional pin layout for the balance cable. Same thing, they don't really put the serial number on here. I suspect it's somewhere below. 120 volts, 60 hertz. So this is again a US market unit. Taking a look at the top and the detail work on the chassis. And check this out. On the way to the test bench, I stopped by our scale. This is the table we use to pack things on, which is hooked up to a scale. And believe it or not, this preamp weighs in at 47 pounds. Absolute craziness. That's as much as most amplifiers weigh. Okay, we're now over at the test bench. I'm going to crack this thing open. I suspect this is going to be a metric piece, 2.5 mils. It's funny about the weight of audio equipment. Now that I work full-time with gear, you'll hear me complain about how heavy things are, mostly because I have to move them around. But when I was a fledgling audiophile, I always associated heavy stuff with high-quality stuff. And I guess there is some correlation to it. It doesn't mean it's going to sound good, but when you have a heavy piece, it means that they didn't cheap out on the selection of the materials, the gauge of the steel, and making the thing just a better overall build quality. But again, it has nothing to do with circuitry. So how something sounds is unrelated. But you do see manufacturers make things heavier and heavier every year to try to kind of justify the elevation of the pricing. So, quite interesting. All right, I'm almost there. Now you wonder how Sony made money on pieces like this. The amount of engineering, tooling, and the amount of cost of material, it makes you wonder whether or not they were able to pull profit on pieces like this. I've always assumed that there was a certain number of pieces where they just accepted the fact that they weren't going to make money on them in order to promote other pieces within their lineup. So I've got the first panel off. Let me give you a view of this. All right, so here's the power supply section of this preamplifier. Here we see the transformer, which is housed in some sort of metal. It's probably potted as well. Really nice quality capacitors for the filter stage of the power supply. I can't spot the brand on them. Oh, they're Nichicons. Super thorough is what it says on them. So 3900 microfarads. This seems to be 4 of them. These are in really nice shape. They're not bulging or bubbling or anything. Copper throughout. I can kind of see the copper at the bottom of the chassis. You can see the crazy thickness. Here's the back plate. It's got to be 1/2 inch or so. It looks like an extruded piece for the sides. So fairly simple power supply design here. I don't see anything extravagant. Let's take a look at this. So yeah, about a 1/4 inch thick plate on that. It's super simple. There's a massive Alps potentiometer that we talked about earlier. Although they claimed it was in plastic, it feels like it's got some sort of metal casing on it. So maybe some of the internals are plastic. Fairly neat and tidy, not a lot going on. Here are the little encasement modules they talked about. That's the input and output stages. A lot of the power supply work is being done at the main audio board. Here the cables going to the potentiometer. And the switching being done as close to the input and output jacks as possible. Which would you like to see? I see a bunch of jumpers here with some sort of gold plating on them. Never seen this color PC board before. I'm sure it's just some sort of epoxy, but it's got an interesting color to it. And the bases of the caps have some sort of pads on them that I haven't seen in Sony stuff either right here. Some sort of sticky material or rubberized. See a couple adjustments here for gain, probably left and right channel. Yeah, it's for balance. These labels are Sony branded. That's tricky. If one of these ever goes, you're pretty much done. Some copper bus bars, moving some signals around, probably grounds. And really, it's really simple. There's really very little to this preamp whatsoever. Very high quality XLR jacks here. These are metal, which usually tend to be plastic. And I imagine they've put some of the logic boards up front, but again, very little indeed. Here we see the logic board for the display. There's another one on this side. For capacitors, here we also see some more Nichicons. Two different series. There's gold ones. So there were a couple of things I wasn't following, so I looked at the literature once again, and it's been translated from Japanese, so the wording's a little tricky. So before I mentioned that the rectification was separate from the power supply, and it was just the way it was written. It said that actually the power supply and rectification are in a separate enclosure. So we see them right here. You can see the rectifiers deep in the board there and the power supply here. So that's pretty conventional. Another thing is that on the Alps potentiometer, the potentiometer section itself is made out of plastic, not the housing, which makes complete sense. And lastly, on these modules, here we see the first module labeled balanced amp, preamp, and then nothing on the third one. So these are the input and output modules, and they're made out of some sort of cast metal. And obviously, the board itself does not have surface mount technology. Everything's through hole, but what they referred to was if you were to take one of these out and flip it over, the circuitry in there is in fact surface mount and bound to the other side of this heat sink. So that's kind of an interesting way to go about it. If we go to the Vintage Knob, one of my favorite websites for vintage stuff, you see some better pictures. Here we've got the toroidal transformer outside of its case, and then the Alps potentiometer, all in all its glory. It seems like some sort of brass enclosure. Beautiful piece of art. For those of you unfamiliar, here's a picture of the SCD-1, and here you can see the same sort of design language, the chamfered corners, the blue metal sides, and the old aluminum look to it. Not quite built as heavily and as beautifully as these two pieces, but certainly in the same style or execution. All right, so overall pretty interesting stuff. Incredible simplicity, beautiful build quality, and great selection of materials all throughout. I'm going to close this back up and plug it in and see if we can run some signals through it. I'll put the top back on to make sure we don't pick up any noise or anything. As I was closing it up, I caught something worth sharing. Here are the different copper sandwich structure. So we've got, I think this was like 13 or 14 mils of aluminum, and then you see the sandwich of the copper, which is 2 mils on either side. Really cool layout, how they've recessed a lot of the screws for the circuitry, and this little convection cooling they're utilizing here to get some air through the unit, or at least into the unit. I don't see a way out. The tops were in fact sealed, so not quite sure how much of cooling that's going to provide in the units, since there is no way for the air to circulate. And here's what we're missing. Sony 89234, not for sale. Love to know what that's about. If you guys have any clues, please do share it with us. So not for sale. That's pretty interesting. I wonder what that could be. Perhaps this was some sort of pre-production sample, not meant to be sold, or maybe it was a demo piece at a Sony showroom, or don't really quite know. And I'm curious to see later when we look at the amplifier itself whether or not we've got the same sticker, because if you remember, the amplifier also did not have the serial number engraved into its backplate. So that might have been the reason for not putting the serial number on the plate itself. Alright, so I've got the unit hooked up to my bench now. I'm going to feed a signal into one of the inputs. I've chosen the CD input. Power up the unit. I think it's got about a 10 to 15 second delay on it. I'm going to dial this to 1K at 1 volt. And it's going to go through the TA-E1 up here and then out into the oscilloscope. It'll give us a visual indication of what the signal is going to look like. So we just got to make sure that the tape monitor is turned off. And that's how the tape monitor works. You toggle it on and then you can select between tape 1 and tape 2. And then direct bypass, I suspect, some of those modules, perhaps the balance module and any other sort of superfluous circuitry, and goes right to the outputs. It may even bypass the gain stage, but I'll have to read in the manual to see if that's the case. So I do hear the clicking when I use the selector knob, so those relays in the back are activating accordingly. Then I've got my volume set to something, and let's go ahead and turn on the signal. And we have a signal, and we can see it there in the oscilloscope as we go through the volume range. I do see a slight channel imbalance, and we'll be able to correct that inside. If you remember, the balance module, which was located around here, had gain stages or gain potentiometers on it, so we should be able to dial in the left and the right just perfectly. Interestingly, this does not have a balance control. That's why they've given us potentiometers on the inside. So while you can't change the balance on your listening chair, you can crack the unit open and make fine-tune adjustments to dial it in just perfectly. Not much else to that. Switch over to square wave. No drama there. If I change to direct, it kills the output. And then in terms of, let me get the voltage up. Not much of a current draw either. So that's it for the basic operation of the preamp. Okay, moving on to the amplifier. Now this is a bit heavy for me to carry over to the test bench, so it's going to get looked at here at the island. Same 1/4 inch aluminum top plate. Okay, see what we got. Here are the output transistors 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, the 5 pairs that we discussed earlier. Same material on the PC boards. Supposed to be gold plated. I imagine what they meant was the legs themselves, and they do look to be gold plated. That's pretty cool. Get a bit of light in there. The transformer casing seems to be the same material as the preamp as well. It's pretty cool. So there's a toroidal in here somewhere, probably potted. Interesting construction. They've got these two sort of extruded rails running the length of the unit. I don't know if you can see them well enough, but that's what everything's mounted to for rigidity. Here are the output. Super through Nichicons, again, 27 microfarads. Nichicon caps on the output boards to it, or better yet, Nichicon. I see the same modules that we saw in the preamp. These sort of cast aluminum boards with the surface mount components on them. I see an LED here, but overall very simple layout as well. So it looks like the power supply and the input board is down below and the output board's on the sides. Here we see the same copper chassis that we've seen throughout the series. 1/2-inch aluminum backplate, so you can see through the opening here. Pretty cool stuff, nice layout, super neat and tidy too. There's no big wiring or anything. The output terminals are wound here. And it looks like they ran separate wires to each one. Right, so we've got input control, but there's no output control, obviously, so these are parallel together. The other thing that I noticed is that the geometry is a bit interesting. It kind of slants here on the front, which is kind of cool. Makes it look a little bit more grounded. I didn't notice until I walked away from the unit. So now let's power it up and light these front panel on. Okay, we plugged it into the mains. Power on. Let's get a protection light and an unbalanced selection here. I suspect if I do this, cycle through, and then we've got this blue light that just went on, means that it's out of protection. Give you a better shot of that. Pretty cool. These resistors are kind of cool. I've never seen them in a circular or spherical package. Now we see the LEDs go on. It must be for setting the BIOS of the DC offset. Sorry about the background, I'm running a test. If you can hear the frequency sweep. So there you have it, the internals of the Sony TA-N1. So looking at the vintage knob on this amplifier, a couple of things. Back to those little boards. They're called metal core modules, and they're made out of aluminum alloy circuit board, which circuit patterns are formed with copper and parts are surface mounted. It's a shame we can't get a good look at those. That's an interesting thing that they've actually used an aluminum board to mount these surface mount components. So I'd love to see a picture, but I haven't been able to find one on the internet. Then we see the picture of the amplifier, some rough schematics sort of showing the signal path through the amplifier, the conversion and the feedback. And then the amplifier itself disassembled, which is pretty cool. Here are those 16-pound or 16-kilogram heat sinks, and a better close-up of the interior and back shot. So nothing else to report on the amplifier. I've looked at the manuals for both, and they're fairly simple. There's really not much to them. There's no interesting information or tidbits or anything like that. I did notice on the amplifier when you go to specifications, they do list different specifications for the USA model versus the rest of the world model. It must be because of the line voltage. So that's the manual for the amp, and here's the one for the preamp. Again, really nothing interesting at all. Just a couple of wiring diagrams, how to hook it up to the SCD-1, how to isolate ground for the plug in case you've got some sort of ground loops or anything like that. I'd like to see this in more manuals. We get a lot of calls from clients asking how to get rid of the hum on their newly acquired piece. So not much else online on these things. They are pretty rare. I haven't really found any reviews on them or any sort of in-depth dives about them. I guess at 100 pieces you wouldn't expect these to have made it very far. Oh, I forgot to check the bottom of that amplifier to see whether it's also not for sale. Give me 1 second. Let me flip this beast over. Okay, took everything I've got. And no serial number on the bottom. No indication whether it's for resale or not. So super curious about that. And same design here. We've got those sort of, looks like almost like circuit board material here for heat sinks. I'm sorry, for ventilation, just like the preamp. And it also looks like they use steel for the bottom instead of aluminum. So there you have it. So who are these for? Well, this is for the ultimate Sony collector. If you've absolutely loved Sony, you've got to have a set of these, and they're not easy to find. I've seen maybe 1 or 2 come up over the years. This set is up for sale on our website at skyfiaudio.com. I'll put a link below in case you want to see what the price is and whether we still have them. They're going to be sold as a set. I'd hate to break this up. A bunch of people have asked, hey, could I have the amp or the preamp? And I'd rather not do that. So skyfiaudio.com is where you can see this, and I thank you for watching. It's been fun to make this for you. Please leave comments below. I try to engage and answer just about every comment. And of course, if you liked it and we've earned your respect, please like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.